Okay, well, I'm recording proceedings, and without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to this episode of In Conservation With. And I must quickly mention the sponsors. I always forget. It's Leica Sport Optics and also King's Place Music Foundation, and this is part of their Nature Unwrapped season. So thank you very much, guys, for supporting In Conservation With. I'm with Scott Weidensaul, and we're going to talk about the Birds of Maine. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. But before we do, I just want to say one thing, and that is that if you have any questions, don't forget to slip them in the chat or put your hand up and we'll get to you. All right? So, Scott, good afternoon and welcome. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How are you, David?
You know what? I have two legs and I'm still breathing. I'm here in Spain, and I've been sort of knuckling down quite a lot recently, and the weather hasn't been amazing, but today was lovely and sunny and almost warm. I went out on the bike today and it was quite warm. Anyway, today we're talking about Birds of Maine, and we were meant to be joined by Barbara Vickery as well.
Yes. Barbara is, as far as I know, Barbara is not with us. Unfortunately, we had a big storm that came through coastal New England last night, as Doug Hitchcock's there knows, on coastal Maine. And Barbara in Richmond, Maine, she has power, but she has no Wi-Fi, no internet, and no landlines. So she is a bit heartbroken that she's not able to join us today. She was really looking forward to this. This has been, more than anything else, her labor of love getting this book published. And we would not have been able to do it without her. Okay, well,
let's bring this into context. I mean, this night is about the Birds of Maine, and it is actually about the Birds of Maine, but also associated with it is obviously the book, The Birds of Maine. So can you quickly, before you tell us about your background, just quickly tell us your connection with the book as well as Barbara's?
Sure. So the book is written primarily by Peter Vickery. Peter was a dear friend of mine. We taught together for more than 20 years at National Audubon's Hog Island Camp, which is an adult ornithology camp on the coast of Maine in Muscongas Bay. Peter had been birding in Maine since he moved here more than 40 years ago, and we can get into this a little bit later in more detail, but he had wanted to create the first really comprehensive look at the birds of Maine in more than 70 years. Unfortunately, Peter was diagnosed with cancer in 2015 and quickly realized that he was probably not going to live long enough to complete this magnum opus. And so he assembled a team of fellow ornithologists and to serve as co-authors. Barbara and I served as co-managing editors on this project. Peter died in 2017, and we've been working to complete the roughly 1/4 of the book that still needed to be done after Peter's death. So when I say it's been a labor of love, that's been very much the case.
Okay. Well, we're looking forward to learning more about the book and how it all sort of fitted together. But firstly, let's find out a bit more about you, Scott. So where did you come into the picture when it comes to birding and nature and conservation?
Well, I'm a bit of a carpetbagger when it comes to birding in Maine. As I said, I've been teaching summers in Maine for about 20 years, but I grew up and lived almost all my life in Pennsylvania, and that's where I got hooked on birds. Those who've birded in the U.S. may be familiar with Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. It's the world's oldest sanctuary for birds of prey. I lived very close to Hawk Mountain. I kind of lived in the shadow of Hawk Mountain. And I got hooked. Well, I got hooked on birds pretty much right out of the womb, but I got hooked on raptors when I was about 12 years old. Made a trip to Hawk Mountain on an absolutely perfect fall migration day. The sky was just alive with accipiters and bootios and falcons. And I was this little 12-year-old smart kid with a pair of really crappy 7x35 binoculars and a copy of Chan Robbins' Golden Field Guide to the Birds, which I had been studying like a Bible. And I'm standing up there on the rocks and yelling out identifications, there's a Cooper's hawk, there's a, and no idea what I was doing, absolutely no idea what I was talking about. And there was an older woman sitting on the rocks in front of me who kept kind of, turning around and staring at me and then going back to hawk watching. And finally, after I, yelled something about a peregrine falcon, which was probably just a sharp-shinned hawk, she sighed and she put down her binoculars and she turned around and she said, "Son, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about." And then she said, "Sit down here next to me." And the next hawk that came by, she said, "Okay, see how this hawk flaps and then glides and flaps and then glides? It's an accipiter. It's one of the forest hawks." And she started to talk about how to differentiate Cooper's hawks from sharp-shinned hawks. That was the beginning of my education as a hawk watcher. And on that day, in October of my 12th year, 3 things happened to me that really have shaped my life. I got hooked on raptors and have remained hooked on raptors ever since. That's the group of birds that I have worked with most closely as a bander and a researcher, the ones that I'm still most in love with. I got hooked on migration, the notion that there were birds coming from places as far afield as the Canadian Arctic and Greenland and passing literally over my house en route to places like Argentina and Brazil. And I've been following bird migration in the 50 some years ever since then. And I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, among which I had grown up, and had not really realized that you had this 2,000-mile long mountain range stretching from Newfoundland all the way deep into the American South, along which this river of migrant raptors passes every year. So not a bad day's work for a 12-year-old. I mean, it really kind of set me on my path, both professionally and personally, for the rest of my life.
Okay, so I just had to mute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
That's an amazing story. I mean, birds of prey, raptors are such an evocative group, aren't they? Just no one can fail to be captivated by the sight of kettles of birds of prey, or even just one bird of prey drifting over. They're just so impressive, aren't they?
Well, and in fact, that day, as is the case with a lot of hawk watches, at Hawk Mountain, they have a plastic owl decoy sitting up on top of a high pole, and a lot of the falcons and hawks that pass by take a dive at it. And I was sitting at the base of this pole with my binoculars, watching a sharp-shinned hawk come down the ridge, and it locked onto the owl and started diving straight at it. And of course, it looked like it was diving straight at me. And I was sitting there watching this thing get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger in my glasses until I remember dropping my glasses in shock and watching this thing whiz right over my head. If that doesn't get you hooked, you don't have a pulse, frankly.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. I've had one episode like that when I was where was I? I was in the Faroe Islands,
Yeah.
and I was watching a meadow pipit, and all of a sudden a merlin appeared from nowhere and started chasing this meadow pipit. And the meadow pipit flew towards me, and I don't think the merlin saw me until it was literally about 6 feet away from me. And it did a 180-degree turn in mid-flight and then flew off in the opposite direction as soon as it saw me. It was just remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
Well, the laws of physics do not apply to merlins.
Say again?
I said that the laws of physics do not apply to merlins.
Exactly. Now, just for those people out there, the Zoomers here, and also the people in the future, because obviously there's a future, people will be watching this in the future, so hello to the future. Can you just explain where Maine is, and just a quick sort of potted history? Because, if I had a map of the US and I had a gun to my head and someone asked me to point out where North Dakota was, I would say, just shoot me.
Well, the sad part is a lot of Americans are probably in the same boat. So Maine is the northeasternmost state. It's the northernmost part of New England. It's the largest of the 5 New England states. In fact, the 6 New England states. It's bigger than the other 5 New England states put together. It's tucked in the corner up there below New Brunswick and Quebec, with the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy on one side of it. And it's a remarkably diverse state. It has, depending on how you measure such things, between 2,000 and 5,000 miles of coastline, because it's incredibly crenulated and wrinkled. There are literally thousands of offshore islands, some of them not much bigger than a rock, others, the size of small counties. You can have a diversity of habitat ranging from oak forests and salt marshes in the south to boreal spruce forests in the north. Katie, is holding up a map showing Maine in purple. There, I do have a map a little bit later that you can get a better idea. But thank you for the AV help there, Katie. Much appreciated. It's a pretty cool place. It is a culturally very distinct place, although becoming a little bit more homogenized, especially in southern and coastal Maine. A lot of people have been moving to Maine over the years. The old joke in Maine was that one day a lobsterman didn't have his stern man who helps in the back of the boat wasn't available, so his pregnant wife went out to help him pull his lobster traps, and while she was out in the boat, she gave birth. And they came back to shore. The child grew to adulthood. He lived into a ripe old age, and as a 90-year-old was being buried, and the minister said, as they lowered him in the ground, "We bid farewell to this stranger to our shores, because if you're not from Maine, you're never from Maine." So that's a little taste of Maine. Maine. The other great thing about Maine is that, from an ornithological perspective, it really runs the gamut. In southern Maine, you can have species like snowy egrets that you would more readily associate with the southern U.S. And if you got in a boat and started sailing up the coast of Maine, by the end of the day, you'd find yourself off rocky treeless islands swarming with Arctic terns and common murres, guillemots, black guillemots, razorbills, and Atlantic puffins. Birds that are much more typical of the far north and the subarctic than they are of the south. So we squeeze an awful lot into the state of Maine.
And talking about squeezing an awful lot, how many people live in Maine?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly what the population is. I can tell you it's 35,000 square miles, but I don't know what the population per square mile is. I will tell you that there are significant parts of Maine. You get away from the coast and southern Maine. Maine is one of the least populated states in the lower 48. Many parts of northern Maine are still essentially unorganized land. Parts of Maine are still referred to as plantations, dating back to the colonial time. Not in the sense of a southern a southern cotton plantation, but I mean this is a term that goes back to the 1600s, and they're still plantations because they never had enough people to qualify as towns. Large parts of Maine are essentially uninhabited forest, especially boreal spruce forest.
Beautiful. We've had a couple of messages in the chat since my question. It's 1.3 million people inhabit Maine, which is great. Okay, so listen.
May I just say that we're actually very lucky to have Doug Hitchcox as one of the participants on the call. Doug works for Maine Audubon. He's one of the top birders, I would argue maybe the top birder in the state of Maine. And when we get into my presentation, you're going to be seeing a lot of Doug's pictures because Doug is very generous with his photography in helping us promote this book.
Fantastic. Well, listen, let's kick off and let's find out more about the birds of Maine.
All right, so bear with me for a moment here. I'm going to turn off my video because I don't have a whole lot of bandwidth here. I'm in rural New Hampshire. I'm 6 miles from the Maine border. New Hampshire is the next little state just to the west of Maine, where our motto is "Live Free or Die," which tells you a lot about the state of New Hampshire. I'm going to turn off my video to preserve bandwidth, and then I'm going to go to launching my presentation. So everyone just bear with me for a moment here.
No problem. I can do the segueing for you. I hope that in the party time at the end that Doug reveals himself so we can congratulate him for his photographs and hear about some of his birding moments in Maine. So, but it's always nice to hear birding stories, but I'm looking forward to learning about Maine. One of the things I found out really, I suppose, was that when this book was coming out, I was thinking to myself, I have to get these guys on because I want to learn, I want to find out, because it's one of those places in the US, as far as I'm concerned, that I don't know too much about. I've never been to Maine either, so I'm looking forward to this.
Well, David, we have this terrific ornithological camp called Hog Island that's been run by the National Audubon Society since 1934. We should talk about getting you over as an instructor sometime, and that would you'll pardon the phrase, kill two birds with one stone.
Sounds good to me.
Are you seeing the cover of the book?
Yes, we've got the book cover.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much for your patience.
So, actually,
So the Bird of Maine,
sorry, Scott, before you start, if anyone can't see the book cover clearly or Scott's presentation, if you go to speaker view, then you'll have the whole screen. If you're in gallery view, obviously it's going to be very difficult because you'll be seeing everyone else as well. So go to speaker view, top right corner, I think, of the your screen, and click on that. If you've got any issues, contact Maya in the chat and she'll help you.
all right. So, so the Birds of Maine, this book just came out actually within just the last couple of weeks. It's published jointly by Princeton University Press and the Nuttall Ornithological Club, which is based outside of Boston. It's the oldest ornithological club in the United States. And it represents, as I said earlier, the decades-long efforts of Peter Vickery to create really the first comprehensive work on Maine's birds in the last 70 years or so. And as I said in the introduction, it represents a labor of love on behalf of a large team of editors and co-authors and artists and cartographers and designers, bringing Peter's vision to fruition following his death in 2017. Peter was not originally from Maine. He moved there in the 1970s and began birding in the state. This is a picture of him in the 1970s on the Blue Nose Ferry between Maine and Nova Scotia. And his Bible in those days, as was the case for many Maine birders, was a book that came out in 1949, written by a fellow named Ralph Palmer, called Maine Birds, which was the first state bird book for the Birds of Maine. But because it was published in 1949, Palmer's book, Peter realized, was increasingly outdated. And so he started gathering material for an update. It started with an annotated checklist that he published in 1978 in cooperation with Audubon. And in addition to Peter's extensive field work, and Peter was in the field constantly, he began gathering volumes of old records, hunting down obscure, long out-of-print journals, corresponding with scores of birders across the state, all with the goal of creating a comprehensive update to Palmer's original book. Now, anybody who's ever tackled a project of that sort knows it always takes way longer than you think it is going to. And that was the case with the Birds of Maine and Peter. And he worked on this. He thought he'd be able to knock this out in a decade or so. And 30 or 40 years later, he was still working on it. When Peter got what turned out to be a terminal cancer diagnosis in 2015, his doctor advised him, because his doctor understood how important this project was for him, advised him to gather a team to help him finish this project. And so, in addition to his good friend Bill Sheehan, Bill's the fellow in blue there, who was already doing the waterfowl accounts, Peter recruited a team of noted Maine ornithologists who are also very good friends of his. Charles Duncan, who's the former director of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and Dr. Jeff Wells, who's currently a vice president for boreal bird conservation at the National Audubon Society, asking them to be co-authors and asking me to serve eventually with his wife Barbara as managing editors. Peter was also friends with the Swedish bird artist Lars Johnson, who is the gigantic Viking in the middle of that picture right there. This is Peter and Bill and Lars on Monhegan Island. Lars agreed to do a series of watercolors for the book, while Maine native Barry Van Dusen from Massachusetts, who's another highly respected bird artist in North America, offered his extensive archive of line art for the project and did several dozen specially commissioned pieces for it. As I said, my connection with Peter goes back to Hog Island Ornithology Camp on the Maine coast, where we taught together for more than 20 years, several times every summer. Always the high point of my summer to get out with Peter in the field. And so the result, which was just published on November 3rd, is this 642-page testament to Peter. He completed about 3/4 of the species account. So this is by far and large Peter's work here, covering all 464 species of birds recorded in the state, including extinct species like great auk, Labrador duck, passenger pigeon, Eskimo curlew. There's Maine, little bit easier to look at than Katie's iPhone. Kind of snugged up, as I said, in the corner between Quebec and New Brunswick, with the other states of New England to the west and south of it. Maine is by far the largest and most northerly state in New England. And as I said earlier, has this range of habitats from oak forest to boreal bogs, spruce wood, tundra-like blueberry barrens in down East Maine, which is the part of the coast farthest to the north and east. And because of that diversity, Maine packs a remarkable variety of birds into its 35,000 square miles. And what it's best known for are its boreal northern species like blackback woodpecker, Canada jay, boreal chickadee. And again, I just want to thank Doug Hitchcox for allowing us to use so many of his great photographs in this presentation. Maine is also the only US state with nesting Atlantic puffins. And there's a fascinating story that I can get into a little bit later. The puffins are back in Maine because of groundbreaking conservation work over the past 40 years. But Maine, because it sits on the Gulf of Maine, as a whole, is very rich in breeding and migrant seabirds. So just to give you a sense of the book starts with some extensive introductory chapters that were written by the editors and the co-authors with a number of outside experts, covering a lot of ground, exploring why Maine has the birds it has, how human history has shaped Maine's avifauna and is continuing to shape it as time goes on here. For example, we look at Maine's birds through the lens of the state's topography, its climate and its land, how complex ocean currents in the Gulf of Maine exert a really profound influence on the mainland. Like, for example, the dense spruce forests that thrive along the down east coast, which is where you're going to find a lot of otherwise much more northerly birds like spruce grouse and a lot of the boreal warblers. Those spruce forests are there thanks to persistent low temperatures and perennial fog along that part of the coast. We take a look at Maine's ornithological history from the time of European settlement up to the present, including notable figures as Theodore Roosevelt, who's not somebody that you normally associate, at least Americans don't normally associate him with Maine, but a lot of Roosevelt's early conservation ethos came out of his exposure to wildlife and wildlands in Maine. And people like Cordelia Stanwood, who were pioneering female ornithologists. We also take a deep dive, and a highly detailed deep dive, into the state and conservation needs of Maine's birds. We felt it was important to spend a lot of time in the book discussing where things stand right now with the conservation of Maine's birds, how things have changed over time, where we think Maine's avifauna is heading, and what actions we recommend for protecting and preserving these birds in the face of rising human population and changing climate. One of our goals was to make a book that was as attractive as it was ornithologically rich, and I think we succeeded in that. We had a wonderful cartographer that we worked with, a fellow named Bill Hancock with the Nature Conservancy, who created dozens, well, actually hundreds of maps for the book, including end papers that show the full Maine coast and all of its seabird breeding islands, a series of detailed regional maps that show all of the important bird and birding locations in the state, and range maps for every species of bird that reaches any kind of a range limit in the state. And many of these range maps also show how the species abundance and distribution has changed over time. We were absolutely delighted that Peter's old friend Lars Johnson agreed early on to create a series of watercolors for the book. That was another important part of our goal, to make this book as beautiful as it was ornithologically rich. Lars had never been to Maine, but he made a number of research trips over here at various times of the year in order to observe and paint some of the iconic Maine species like Bicknell's thrush on the high elevation spruce forests of Maine's mountains, olive-sided flycatchers in Maine's extensive bog wetlands. Maine is 25% freshwater wetlands. It has more wetlands than all the rest of New England combined, and those wetlands are incredibly important for many species of breeding birds. And if I were to commit grand larceny, it would probably be this painting, this snowy owl in the farmlands of Aroostook County up in northern Maine. I've been studying snowy owls for years, and he's really captured something special with that species in this painting. In addition to providing hundreds of his existing ink and pencil drawings, Barry Van Dusen, whom I mentioned earlier, also created dozens of commission drawings for the book. So we had an embarrassment of riches here in terms of the amount of art that we were able to bring into this book. as is the case with most state bird books, where it's a deep dive into the ornithological history and status of the birds of a particular state, the majority of this book is made up of these really extensive species of counts, each of which details the bird status in Maine, both today and historically, provides notes on its conservation condition. But the meat of each account is in these really highly detailed seasonal sections covering, oh goodness, migration timing, breeding, high counts, late dates, this incredibly complete summary of pretty much everything that we know about that species in Maine. And in many cases, the accounts also include maps based on the latest tracking data showing where Maine's birds go at other times of the year. We thought it was important to bring in the fact that, of course, many of these species breed in Maine or migrate through Maine, but that is not where they spend the majority of their time. So, for example, whimbrels, as you can see there, whimbrels don't breed in Maine. Most of them are breeding in the Canadian Arctic and subarctic, but many of them pass through Maine in late summer and early autumn, staging up on the blueberry barrens of down east Maine, feeding on blueberries, and then taking off on these long transatlantic flights down to the Lesser Antilles in South America. And this book would not be complete without a species account on what is without doubt the most exceptional Maine bird record of all, one that came fairly late in the process of our working on this book. A great black hawk that showed up in 2018, a very, very long way from the Central American tropics where this bird normally is found, to the utter astonishment of pretty much everyone. It is going to be a long time before we beat that as the most remarkable of Maine's bird records. One of the cool things about working on a book like this is that, by taking the long view, in this case, really about a 70-year perspective, Birds of Maine also provides a window on how Maine's avifauna has changed over the last 7 decades, since the 1949 publication of Ralph Palmer's Maine Birds. Some species have done extraordinarily well. Canada geese, which were not really even a nesting species in Maine until a few were released in the 1950s, now breed on even most of the most remote offshore islands. Their numbers have increased 46,000% since the 1960s. But wild turkeys have actually done even better. Since they were reintroduced to the state in the 1970s, they've exploded in range, they've exploded in abundance, and if you want to talk about it in terms of statistics, they have increased 810,000% since 1970. By contrast, bank swallows, which are sand martins to those of you in the UK, were once very common summer residents throughout the state, but they fared so badly that today only 0.2% of their 1966 population remains in Maine, mostly in the southern counties. One of the things that we were able to do in working on the Birds of Maine is take a look at all the trend data that we have out there and see how the birds of Maine as a whole are faring. And, not surprisingly, there have been winners and losers. Of the species that breed in Maine, 27 species have shown significant increases based on breeding bird surveys. And for those of you who aren't in North America, the BBS is a project that was started in the 1960s. It's run by the US Geological Survey. There are thousands of breeding bird survey routes that are run every year by highly trained volunteers and agency personnel, counting all of the primarily singing male birds that are heard within a certain period of time along these routes year after year after year. It's not an ideal survey, but it's really, for many species, the best index we have of how their populations are doing. Not surprisingly, a lot of those 27 species that are showing significant increases are birds that are habitat generalists, year-round residents or short-distance migrants, or species like Canada geese or wild turkeys that have received some sort of human intervention. And you can see, like, for example, wild turkeys are increasing at a 19% annual increase. That is almost straight up. That's like the increase we've been seeing in some parts of the US with COVID. Other species are doing well, although not nearly to the same extraordinary extent. And then about 73 species of birds in Maine, breeding species of birds in Maine, didn't show any significant trend up or down. That said, there were 62 species of breeding birds that did show declining trends. Some of them, like the bank swallow, dropping at 11% a year, as I already mentioned, truly alarming. Many of these are foraging specialists or habitat specialists like grassland birds, or they're long-distance neotropical migrants. But you might be surprised to see great blackback gull on there as a strongly declining species. We can talk about that. I'll talk about that again in just a moment, why gulls have been on the downturn, but that's partly a response to the fact that the gulls for much of the 20th century were exploding in number. But even widespread abundant species like song sparrows and American robins have been showing small declines over long periods of time. What's interesting, though, is that in some cases, different monitoring systems produce trends. American robins, cedar waxwing, Savannah sparrows up there at the top, all of these have shown small long-term declines in breeding populations as measured by the Breeding Bird Survey. But if you look at Christmas bird count data, National Audubon Society has been conducting the Christmas bird count for more than 100 years across North America. Those same species exhibit really robust increases. So the reason for that is probably that, yes, Maine's breeding populations of these birds have been declining ever so slightly. But with the warming climate, the populations that breed farther to the north are not migrating as far south, and probably many of Maine's breeding individuals in these species are not migrating out of the state as they once did. So their wintering populations have increased substantially. All of that is almost certainly linked to a warming climate, and climate change, along with habitat modifications, landscape modifications, have allowed a lot of species that were at least originally southern to push north, some of them making really dramatic range advances in a relatively short period of time, a matter of decades, like northern cardinals, northern mockingbirds, turkey vultures. Again, a lot of the range maps that we include in the book show changing distribution over time. So you can see how northern cardinals have been spreading out from southern and coastal Maine farther and farther north over the last 30 or 40 years. Over the last 40 years, tufted titmice have slowly occupied more and more of southern Maine. They're not making huge advances every year, but they're slow and steady. Whereas red-bellied woodpeckers have just basically been like an army on the march. Red-bellied woodpeckers are now, they've shown up as far north and east as Newfoundland at this point. And I suspect they're going to be found across most of Maine and the Maritimes within the next 10 or 20 years. Interestingly, though, you can expect that a lot of these southern species would be pushing north because of climate change. But we've also seen some dramatic pushes to the south by northern species. For example, fox sparrows in the last, 30 years or so have pushed more than 250 miles south from their breeding range in Quebec. And this has happened not just in Maine, but across neighboring states and provinces. And merlins have made a really dramatic expansion, not just across Maine, but all of eastern North America. They didn't nest in Maine anywhere until about 1986. They're now found throughout the state and are found as far south as Maryland and West Virginia, which is like about halfway down the eastern seaboard in North America. Really, really dramatic expansion and recovery for the small falcon. Maine holds a really significant place in the history of seabird conservation. Back in the 1970s, a young seabird biologist named Steve Kress, who worked for the National Audubon Society and who was an instructor at the Hog Island camp that I mentioned earlier, was flipping through a copy of Ralph Palmer's 1949 Maine Birds and came across a reference to the fact that Atlantic puffins had nested on Eastern Egg Rock, which is this fairly desolate treeless island about 9 miles farther offshore from Hog Island. Well, there hadn't been any puffins nesting anywhere in the state of Maine in Maine waters for more than a century. They'd been extirpated by feather hunters, meat hunters, and egg collectors. And Steve got the idea to try to reintroduce puffins to the state of Maine. And so starting in the 1970s, he began bringing puffin chicks from the huge colonies up in Newfoundland back to Eastern Egg Rock, pioneering a whole series of techniques that have since been used not only to reestablish puffins in Maine. There are now puffin colonies on 6 islands in the Gulf of Maine, totaling more than 1,200 pairs. But many other species of seabirds as well. They pioneered techniques, what are known as social attraction techniques, using decoys and lures, mirror box, to try to create the illusion, the sight and the sound of thriving seabird colonies, and thus, attract alcids like puffins and murres and guillemots, terns and other seabirds to reestablish lost colonies. This is an approach that is now being used worldwide on dozens of species of threatened and endangered seabirds. And in fact, the factory that produces those conservation decoys for use around the world is now run by the National Audubon Society, also in Maine at the mainland facility for the Hog Island camp. Maine is about 90% forest. It's the most heavily wooded state in the United States. And consequently, large percentages of the global populations of a number of species of birds, many of them in decline, nest in Maine, which means that the state has a significant role in conservation responsibility for these species. And by the way, if you think it's odd to see, those of you who know Blackburnian warblers, that's normally a treetop species. If you think it's kind of odd to see a Blackburnian warbler on the rocks, you need to come to Monhegan Island off the coast of Maine in springtime when you get these waves of warblers coming through, many of them foraging in the intertidal zone and hopping around in stacks of lobster traps, looking for insects on a cold, not too far from winter Maine spring day. The past decades have also shown us how complicated nature can be and how changes to a single species can have really wide-ranging impacts on many others. The resurgence of bald eagles in Maine, from a few dozen pairs in the 1970s to more than 800 pairs today, is indisputably a remarkable conservation success story. But that recovery has had an impact on a number of other birds. You know, nothing in nature exists in a vacuum, and there's ripple effects in any ecosystem. You know, the eagle recovery coincided with a similar recovery by great cormorants, as we call them on this side of the Atlantic, which had been extirpated from the state for many years. They were driven to extinction locally in the 19th century. But through the 20th century, their numbers grew. They expanded from a few tiny colonies in way offshore islands, colonizing down from Canada. Their numbers were expanding into the hundreds and hundreds of pairs. But as the eagles came roaring back, they discovered that great cormorant chicks taste really good. And so eagle predation on great cormorant nests became a dramatically increasing issue. And they've now, you know, eagles are basically in the process of driving great cormorants back onto the state endangered species list. Their populations are dwindling once again. Similarly, in places like Muscongus Bay along the mid-coast of Maine, bald eagles are exerting a tremendous predation pressure on nesting osprey populations. In fact, over the last couple of years, very few osprey nests in Muscongus Bay have fledged any chicks. The bald eagles have been coming in and picking them off. Sometimes on camera, we have a nest cam on the osprey nest at Hog Island, and people have watched as bald eagles have come in and snatched those osprey chicks. But you know, there's winners and losers in all of this. You know, I mentioned that great blackback and herring gull populations are in fairly steep decline. Their numbers had exploded in the early years of the 20th century, especially the middle of the 20th century, thanks to the offshore fishing industry, which produced tremendous amounts of bycatch, and also these big open landfills on the mainland. And in the late 80s and 90s, a couple of things happened that really started to send gull populations back down again. One was that the offshore industry, fishing industry, was largely shut down, and all of those open pit landfills were closed, so they had a lot less garbage to feed on. But then eagles came along, and for great blackback gulls in particular, eagle predation on gull chicks has been a really significant issue. But again, there's always winners and losers, because as the gull population has dropped, that has taken pressure off common eider populations. Great blackback gulls in particular are tremendously effective predators on eider chicks. And in many years, there were very, very few eider chicks being produced, even out of some of the large eider colonies. And so as the eagles have been putting increased pressure on gull populations, the reduced gull predation has allowed the eider populations to start to bounce back in a few places. Some of the changes that we get are simply a mystery. And I want to leave you with maybe one of the most dramatic and puzzling of all the ornithological mysteries in Maine. One of the most remarkable ornithological spectacles in Maine happened every year on Passamaquoddy Bay, which was right on the Maine-New Brunswick border. Passamaquoddy Bay is just off the Bay of Fundy. It has this incredibly complex complex topography and these surging tidal currents moving among all the channels and islands creates this gigantic whirlpool that's known locally as the Old Sow. It's the largest tidal whirlpool in the Western Hemisphere. And the currents from the Old Sow bring marine food up to the surface, which attracts immense numbers of migrant Bonaparte's gulls and other species of gulls. And for many years, through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, also attracted up to 3 million red-necked phalaropes that staged every year on Passamaquoddy Bay. This is a picture from 1982, giving a little sense of what these immense numbers of red-necked phalaropes. Now, these are birds that were breeding in the Canadian Arctic, the eastern central Canadian Arctic, and were migrating to, well, until recently, we really didn't know where they were migrating to. In fact, today we're even just making an educated guess as to where they go. But what was dramatic and fascinating was that in a matter of a few years, starting in the early 1980s, the number of red-necked phalaropes on Passamaquoddy Bay began to collapse from about 200,000 birds in 1985 to 20,000 birds in 1987 to 20 birds in 1989 and essentially none thereafter. The cause of that disappearance and where the phalaropes moved to remains a mystery. Although some scientists believe the changes in this part of the bay, in the marine ecosystem in this part of the bay, lie at the root of the change. In the words of Charles Duncan, one of our co-authors in the Birds of Maine, who documented this collapse as it was happening, he said that restaurant isn't serving that particular meal any longer. The zooplankton that the phalaropes fed on apparently is not available in the abundance that it once was. But where those phalaropes went, we don't really know. We do now think we know where these phalaropes were going on their migration. And that's thanks to work that was done in Shetland. Geolocators that were put on red-necked phalaropes in Shetland show that the birds going from Shetland migrate across the North Atlantic. They stage up near the Bay of Fundy and then fly south across the Gulf of Mexico, across Mexico itself, and winter off the western coast of South America, somewhere between the mainland and the Galapagos Islands. And we can only assume that the North American breeding red-necked phalaropes that once also staged in the Bay of Fundy followed a similar track. It just goes to show, even in this day and age, how little we know about some of our most widespread and abundant species. These kind of changes, for good and ill, both dramatic and subtle, that's one of the things that makes ornithology fascinating. And I think I speak for everybody on the Birds of Maine team when I say that we take a great deal of satisfaction knowing that with this book, we've laid down a baseline that is going to be important for generations to come, because those ornithologists after us are going to be tracking continuing changes to Maine's bird life in the way that we've done looking back over the last 70 years or so. And so with that, I will stop sharing screen here and restart my video. And
that was absolutely incredible. The book itself, I've looked at the book, and it's one of those books I could look and read every single entry because it appeals to my interest in learning about the whole history of the natural history, as well as all types of history concerning that particular species. Meticulous isn't enough to describe it. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's really amazing. The last point you made regarding migration, we know nothing about it, and to think of 3 million red-necked phalaropes back in the mid-80s, and we struggle here in Britain, well, I'm not in Britain now, but in Britain, to go to Shetland and maybe see, if you're lucky, 2 or 3. It's just mind-boggling. It's incredible.
It really is. Well, I think it's also it's a reminder not to take anything for granted. The things that you're seeing today, just through changes in the environment. And I should say that nobody thinks that these phalaropes died. It's not like the Eastern Canadian breeding population took a dive. They just went somewhere else. But wherever they are, they're not gathering, at least not that we know of, in the kind of numbers that birders were able to see in the 70s and 80s in Passamaquoddy Bay. I went through that area at that time of the year in those days and didn't know about the phalarope concentrations, and so never made an effort to stop and see them. And you better believe that I'm kicking myself for that. I wish that's one of those ornithological spectacles I wish I'd been able to lay claim to myself.
Yeah, speaking of ornithological spectacles, I mean, and also speaking of not knowing or not taking things for granted and the next day they're gone, one of the things that struck me when I was reading through the book, and you mentioned them earlier, are the four classic, stereotypical, extinct, in inverted commas for some of them, birds, namely the great auk, Eskimo Curly, your passenger pigeon, which most people know about, and also most interesting, well, I mean, they're all interesting, but the Labrador Duck, which some of us may not know about, but the Labrador Duck, which looked like a cross between an eider and something else, and had a strange bill, and it wasn't really recorded much, even at the beginning of, populations moving to Maine.
Yeah, the Labrador Duck's an interesting one because we actually don't have any documented records of Labrador Duck in Maine. There are no specimen records, there are no site records, but it based on what we know of its migration and its range, it had to have occurred in Maine. It nested to the north, probably in Labrador or the Canadian subarctic, and it wintered as far south as Long Island in New York. So it came through Maine waters. But it must have had an extremely small population. It became extinct in the 1870s. We know virtually nothing about it. Its nest was never discovered. Audubon looked for it when he made his expedition to Labrador in the 1840s, was without any success. It was also known as the sand shoal duck, which tells us a little bit about what the hunters knew about its ecology. It was apparently a shallow offshore species, probably fed on mollusks based on its bill, and that's about all we know about it. It's one of those enduring mysteries.
Yeah, and I remember as a kid watching a film, animated film called The Last of the Curlews. I was maybe about 5 or 6 years old, and I ended up crying my eyes out at the end, wondering why are people killing these birds, and why didn't I get a chance to see it? Why didn't you give me a chance? Eskimo Curly is another classic bird that used to number in its millions. Do you think that it may still exist?
That's a good question. Back in the late '90s, I spent a lot of time down in Argentina with a group that was working on Swainson's hawk conservation, and I spent every free moment that I had scanning the playa lakes down there, looking for an Eskimo curlew because they wintered in the pampas of Argentina. I'm skeptical. There are so many good birders now, and Eskimo curlews nested in the most remote parts of the Canadian Arctic, but in their migration, they traveled down along the New England coast. They stopped off in places like Maine and Massachusetts, where there are an awful lot of good birders today. In the springtime, they flew up through the center of the continent, up through the Great Plains. Never say never, but and nothing would make me happier. I mean, I think of any of the extinct birds that we are, that there's a chance might still be out there, the Eskimo curlew would put the biggest smile on my face. One could argue that the only reason Columbus made it through without suffering a mutiny was because of Eskimo curlews. His crew was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, ready to mutiny, and out of the night sky they heard the sounds of birds. They said it sounded like the ringing of sleigh bells. That was the description of Eskimo curlew flight calls, was the ringing of sleigh bells. And they were passing through in October at the peak of the Eskimo curlew migration. And Eskimo curlews, as you say, were almost as numerous as passenger pigeons. They numbered in the hundreds of millions. And so their flocks flying out over the Western Atlantic between the New England coast and South America, they must have been audible to anybody in a tiny little sailing ship down on the water. So, you can actually blame an awful lot of this on Eskimo curlews for not getting Columbus discouraged and turning him around.
Yeah, absolutely. And also the passenger pigeon's another classic. I mean, millions upon, in fact, billions perhaps. Do you say in the book 2 to 3 billion may have existed, and flocks took hours and hours and hours to fly over. I mean, that's something that, I would love. It's like a dream. I'd love to have witnessed something like that. And I feel very angry sometimes that we, modern day people, didn't have the chance to see that. But I suppose if you extrapolate that, I'm hoping that the future people, the kids, and their kids won't look back at us and think, why did you kill, the tiger or the pangolin? It's just, anyway, we move on. I'm going to start getting very emotional about this.
Well, but let me just add one point, because I think one of the things that really struck me in the course of working on this book um, is the recognition that if we put our minds to it, we can do great things. We can turn things around. I mean, the work that Steve Kress and the folks at National Audubon have done for seabird conservation around the world, starting on the coast of Maine 40 years ago, has been dramatic. It takes perseverance. It takes grit. It takes a lot of tenacity. It takes a lot of political willpower. But we can change things. We can change things for the better. When I started birding in the mid to late 1960s, bald eagles were almost extinct. Peregrine falcons were almost extinct in the United States. Ospreys, wild turkeys were a rare bird where I grew up in the mountains of Pennsylvania. All of those species, because of human intervention and people doing the right thing, have come roaring back. What we need to do is figure out a way to harness our political will and our political muscle and get behind bird conservation, because the birds will do their part if we only give them a chance.
Absolutely. Now, we have a couple of questions, but what we'll do them in the party zone time, if that's all right, Jim. But listen, it's been amazing what you've been saying today and about Maine. And I really, really do want to come and see Maine for myself. I have 100 questions in terms of the bird life there, but let me ask you one question.
Sure.
What is your favorite bird?
Up until a couple of years ago, if you'd asked me that, it was a pretty simple answer. I've spent the last 25 years studying northern saw-whet owls, which are arguably the most cosmically cute animal on the planet. They're about the size of a beverage can. They weigh about 80 grams. They have the ferocity of an animal 20 times its size. They're small and cute, but they don't know they're small and cute. They're still very much a mystery. But then about 7 years ago, I got involved with studying snowy owls. And I have to tell you that I totally fell under the spell of snowy owls. They're big and sexy and charismatic and magical and have a tremendous power of presence that when you are in the presence of a snowy owl, you are in the presence. And so it's kind of nip and tuck between those two species today, little owls and big owls.
I've never seen a snowy owl before, and I refuse to twitch one. I want to find one naturally. I'm never in North America at the right time, nor am I in the Arctic at the right time. So I'm still waiting.
Well, one of the things that we started over here a couple of years ago, something called Project Snowstorm, and I'd encourage folks to look that up. It's a tracking project. We've put GSM transmitters on 90 snowy owls across North America to study their winter ecology, to try to learn more about them, because they're probably, along with walruses and polar bears and ivory gulls, the species that is at greatest and most direct risk from climate change as things change rapidly in the Arctic. And so we're just starting our winter field work with Project Snowstorm. We've tagged a bunch of snowy owls in Maine over the years, in fact. So you can follow along with the work that we're doing.
Superb. And if you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would you be right now?
Well, I have to say, because of the pandemic, I missed out for the first time in many, many years for doing field work in one of my favorite places on Earth, which is Denali National Park in central Alaska. It is very cold in Denali National Park in central Alaska right now, but if I could be anywhere right now, I would love to be up there watching the northern lights dancing over a 20,000 foot tall mountain peak. That would be pretty sweet.
Fantastic. Absolutely amazing. Okay, we've reached the end of tonight's proceedings. Just to let you know, Zoomers, that on Thursday I have a gentleman called Terry Townsend, who is English, but he lives in Beijing, and he's going to be talking about the birding in Beijing. And I always thought that Beijing was full of smog and you would be lucky to find a sparrow, but he's seen over 450 different species, and he'll be telling us about some of those on Thursday. So, Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been so informative this evening. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there in the Zoom room and in the future wanting to come to Maine and check out some of those birds.
Absolutely. Come up to Hog Island sometime. You can spend a week at ornithological camp for adults. We'll feed you until you beg for mercy. We'll show you Atlantic puffins and all sorts of terrific Maine breeding warblers. It's a great place to get introduced to the birds of Maine.
Fantastic. Well, Scott, thank you very much for sparing your time tonight.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, David.